Okay, so in yesterday's spending review, there were a small number of announcements on school spending, but what was announced could end up being really rather significant. So we thought we'd just spend 5 minutes setting out the potential impact of what was announced yesterday. To set this in context, in terms of overall spending, yesterday the Chancellor confirmed the commitment to protect school spending in England in real terms between 2015-16 and 2019. Because there's going to be really rather significant growth in the pupil population between now and the end of the decade, this is likely to equate to about a 7.5% real terms cut in spending per pupil. That's a lot less generous than what schools were used to in the last Parliament, but it's probably still more generous than other areas of government have received to date. Potentially more significant yesterday was the Chancellor's commitment to introduce a national funding formula for schools in England from 2017 onwards, with the government consulting on detail in early next year. This could be a really big change to the way schools are funded, though, as Paul has said, other governments, including this one, have also previously committed to reform the school funding system. It's been a really rather difficult thing to do in practice. So, to understand the implications of reform, it's important to be clear on how the current system works and what effects it has. So currently, central government allocates money to local authorities, who then allocate money to schools in their area based on a set formula. Each local authority has its own formula, and they give priority to different factors. The main result of this is that there's a large variation in funding across different schools and local authorities. A lot of this reflects that schools and local authorities are different. Deprived schools get more money than less deprived schools. Schools in London get more than schools outside of London, largely because they have to pay higher teacher salaries. However, there's also cases where schools in very similar circumstances can get really quite different levels of funding per pupil. And that's really the focus of the reform the Chancellor announced yesterday. So that sort of variation, schools with similar characteristics getting different levels of funding, can occur for two reasons. First, a discrepancy between measures of need and funding at the local authorities, similar local authorities getting different levels of funding. And secondly, because local authorities give priority to different factors, they make different choices. I just want to illustrate both of these points with a graph. So here, there's a lot going on in this graph, but I think it's a good way of illustrating the implications of the way the current school funding system operates. So each little shape is a local authority. We read down to the x-axis, you see what proportion of the local authority, what proportion of pupils in the local authority is eligible for free school meals. We read across the y-axis, you see the level of funding per pupil in that local authority. And I've drawn different colours for inner London, outer London, and the rest of England. And if we plot a line of best fit through each of these sets of shapes, we see a number of interesting patterns. Firstly, inner London gets more funding than does outer London than does the rest of the country. This reflects the point that inner London and outer London have to pay higher teacher salaries. But you also see quite a significant correlation between social deprivation and the level of funding per pupil. More deprived local authorities get more funding per pupil. But it's not a perfect relationship. For a given level of deprivation, similar local authorities can get quite different levels of funding per pupil. Some of that will reflect the fact that there are other differences in local authorities that we care about and want to fund. Some of it will be purely idiosyncratic and differences we don't want there to be in the first place. And a lot of that will have grown up because we haven't actually had a system for determining funding for people at the local authority level since the early 2000s. They've been getting what they got last year, plus a little bit extra. So the second reason why you can have differences in the funding of similar schools is because local authorities do make quite different choices in their own funding formula. This shows almost one of the most important elements of this. So this is the ratio of the basic amount provided for pupils aged 11 to 14 relative to the basic amount provided for primary school pupils. This accounts for the vast majority of funding allocated by local authorities. And we show the ratio across different local authorities. And what you see is really quite different choices. There are some local authorities who give about 50% more for pupils aged 11 to 14. There's some who give about 20% more. So that's a really big difference. And now, whether that's good or bad is another question. So if you value local information and local policymakers responding to local needs, then maybe you think that's a good use of local discretion. The other view is that this is needless and unjustified variation in the funding of similar schools. The answer to that is not entirely obvious. So faced with these sorts of variation in the funding of schools and local authorities, the government's plan to introduce a national funding formula from April 2017 onwards. As a step in this direction, the government's already implemented some reforms to the school funding system. It topped up the funding of what it deemed to be underfunded local authorities in April 2015. So bringing some of these little shapes from the previous graph back up towards the line of best fit. Going forwards, there are two main options. The first would be re-establishing a formula for allocating funding to local authorities. This would ensure that similar local authorities get similar levels of funding. So in the context of the first graph I showed you, it would be bringing some of those little shapes closer together so that they reflect the characteristics of local authorities. That seems like a good thing to do in practice. However, the exact effect of such a formula will depend on the formula you choose to implement. If the government chose to press ahead with some of the features of the April 2015 reform, it would imply quite large cuts to schools in inner London. The second, more ambitious option would be implementing a school-level formula. So this would replace all the different 150 local authority formula with one single formula for all schools in the country. This would have the similar effect to option one of equalising differences across similar local authorities, but there would also be the effect of harmonising the choices that local authorities currently make. So in the context of the graph on the ratio between secondary and primary ratio, we'd replace that large level of variation with a flat line. So that would lead to some really quite significant changes across different schools. It would create a large number of significant winners and losers. And the fact that you create losers isn't a reason not to press ahead with the policy if you think it's the right thing to do. It does mean it will be difficult, and it will be particularly difficult at a time when we're making real terms cuts to school spending per pupil. It could also imply a loss of local discretion, which might be something you might value. So to sum up, we're going to be seeing about just over 7% real terms cut to school spending per pupil. But more significant this is the plans for a national funding formula. There's lots of options, and different options will have different effects. But one of the key questions for the government in determining which option it wants to press ahead with is how much local discretion should it allow for, and how much is desirable in the long run. In early 2016, the government will publish a consultation, and hopefully this will set out the implications of the different options and also make plans for transitional arrangements, because you wouldn't want some of these changes to happen overnight. Thanks very much.